What if an entire continent vanished without leaving a single accepted place on the map? What if the greatest empire on Earth was not Atlantis, not Egypt, not Mesopotamia, but something older, larger, and far more mysterious? A land of white limestone temples burning beneath the equatorial sun, black volcanic ridges rising above rain-soaked forests, harbors filled with carved ocean vessels rocking in warm Pacific swells. A civilization said to have ruled the sea, linked distant islands, mastered sacred knowledge, and then disappeared almost overnight. No survivors. No accepted ruins. No final warning. Only fragments. Legends whispered across Polynesia, symbols scattered through mystery literature, forbidden books, and one impossible question: was Mu real? Tonight, we descend into one of the most seductive lost world stories ever told. The story of a forgotten Pacific civilization, a drowned continent, and a mystery that refuses to die. Because if Mu was real, then human history is not just incomplete, it is broken. And if Mu was only a myth, why does it still feel like memory? So where does this story begin? With a continent? Or with a need to believe one existed? A vanished world, a question with teeth.
The modern story of Mu did not begin with divers, sonar scans, or ruins at the bottom of the Pacific. It began with interpretation, with old texts, with ambition, and with one dangerous leap from symbol to certainty. In the 19th century, Augustus Le Plongeon claimed that ancient Maya writings referred to a lost motherland called Mu. He believed this vanished land had once stood at the center of early civilization before being destroyed in catastrophe. Most scholars rejected his reading, but the idea had already escaped into the world. Then came James Churchward. And Churchward did not merely mention Mu, he built it. He gave it size, population, architecture, priesthood, roads, sacred order, and apocalypse. According to his version, Mu was a vast Pacific continent stretching thousands of miles, inhabited by some 64 million people, divided into 10 great tribes. He described temple cities, ceremonial highways, advanced knowledge, and an empire older than any civilization recognized by conventional history. In his telling, Mu was not a side note. It was the source, the original center, the mother civilization from which others inherited symbols, wisdom, religion, and power. Egypt became an echo. India became a survivor. Mesoamerica became a branch. The Pacific Islands became broken memories of a drowned whole. That was the genius of the myth. Mu did not just fill a blank on the map, it promised to solve history itself. One origin, one collapse, one answer to 1,000 mysteries. Churchward gave Mu a name, a map, and millions of lives, but he forgot to give it one thing: a single, verifiable stone. A continent in words, nothing in hand. Imagine standing on a stone terrace just before sunrise. The air is warm and wet against your skin. Salt clings to every breath.
Palm leaves flicker in the dark. Below, waves hammer black basalt with a deep, repeating thunder. Then the sun rises, and the city ignites. The temples are carved from pure white limestone, catching the equatorial light with such intensity that sailors far offshore could supposedly see their glow from 50 miles away. Their stairways are broad and steep, worn smooth by generations of bare feet, priests and rulers carrying bowls of smoking resin. Gold roof caps flash like open flame. Red, blue, and ochre pigments still cling to carved reliefs of birds, waves, suns, and serpents. The plazas smell of incense, wet stone, sea wind, and flowering trees. Bronze bells tremble in the morning air. Shelled trumpets call across the courtyards. Drums answer from the harbor below. This is how believers imagined Mu, not a wilderness, but a radiant, tropical super-civilization. A continent of jungle lowlands, volcanic mountains, fertile valleys, and sacred capitals linked by roads of cut stone. A place where astronomy governed ritual, ritual shaped kingship, and kingship bound the empire together. Its harbors were crowded with long ocean-going vessels carved from hardwood trunks, their hulls painted in bright mineral colors, their sails breathing with warm Pacific wind. Its priests tracked stars, its rulers commanded trade, its builders raised terraces, canals, and ceremonial platforms aligned with the heavens. Mu, in this vision, was not merely rich, it was ordained. Its temples were not buildings, they were engines of meaning. Its roads were not roads, they were the veins of empire. And then, according to legend, all of it ended. Not slowly, not gently, but in one convulsion of fire, water, and darkness. Once you can see Mu clearly, you start wanting it to be real. That is where the myth begins to work. Beauty is the bait.
One reason Mu survived so long in the imagination is simple. The Pacific feels large enough to hide it. It is not just an ocean, it is scale itself. A blue emptiness stretching beyond the horizon for thousands of miles, broken only by islands that rise like memory from the water. And scattered across that enormous world are oral traditions about ancestral homelands, migrations, floods, drowned places, and lands that can no longer be reached. This matters, not because these stories prove Mu, they do not, but because myth often preserves emotional truth, environmental memory, and the aftershock of real disaster. The sea feeds. The sea connects. The sea erases. A village can live beside the shoreline for generations, and one wave can turn it into a story. A volcanic island can split open. A reef can drown. A coastline can retreat beyond living memory. In such places, catastrophe does not stay abstract. It becomes sacred narrative. That is why believers searched Pacific myths for clues. Why do so many traditions speak of lost homes? Why do ancestral geographies point toward places now unreachable? Why do stories of flood, migration, and disappearance recur across islands separated by enormous distances? To believers, these were shattered pieces of one original disaster. But there is a more grounded explanation. Coastal societies all over the world develop flood stories because water is power. Island cultures preserve migration histories because navigation was survival. Communities struck by tsunamis, eruptions, and rising seas remember those traumas in story form because that is how memory survives when stone does not. The Pacific does not prove Mu. It explains why Mu feels plausible. The ocean is vast. The silence is deep. And deep silence is where legends breed. The sea says nothing. That is why the myth keeps speaking.
This is where the legend collides with science. And science does not care how beautiful a story sounds. It asks harder questions. What kind of crust lies beneath the Pacific? How do continents actually move? What survives in rock when imagination is stripped away? Legend speaks of a sinking heartland. Science shows something much harsher and much more dramatic. The Earth is not a quiet stage where continents politely appear and vanish. It is a machine of collision, of fracture, of pressure, of fire. Take India. Around 120 million years ago, the Indian plate began racing north after separating from Gondwana. At its peak, it may have moved at around 15 centimeters a year, a geological sprint. That may sound small, but in plate tectonics, it is astonishing. Centimeter by centimeter, year after year, for millions of years, an entire landmass surged toward Asia. Then came the impact. Not a cinematic explosion, something slower, bigger, more relentless. Stone crumpled, crust thickened, seafloor vanished beneath collision, and the Himalayas began to rise, not in a day, not in a year, but through unimaginable force sustained over deep time. That is what real geology looks like. Not continents dropping into the sea like trapdoors, not empires swallowed whole in a single clean motion, but pressure building over millions of years until the planet buckles. The Pacific tells a similar story. Subduction zones, volcanic arcs, seamount chains, oceanic crust being born and destroyed. The Ring of Fire is not a graveyard where continents quietly die. It is a furnace where land is torn apart and violently remade. And that matters, because a continent is not just a legend. A continent is geology. For Mu, in the classic sense, to have existed across the Pacific within the timescale of human civilization, there would need to be evidence for a vanished continent-scale block of continental crust beneath that ocean. There is no accepted evidence for that. Yes, there are ridges, plateaus, submerged fragments, and complex geological structures. Yes, there are real, mostly submerged continental pieces elsewhere in the region, such as Zealandia. But Zealandia is not Mu. It is not a drowned super-civilization. It is a geological structure with a measurable history. And that is the difference between myth and science. Myth wants a kingdom lost in a night. Geology gives us impact, uplift, subduction, magma, time, and violence on a scale the human mind barely knows how to hold. Can islands collapse? Yes. Can coasts drown? Yes. Can volcanoes and tsunamis erase entire human settlements? Absolutely. But a giant Pacific continent vanishing in the way Mu requires? Science says no. Not softly, not vaguely. No. Still, science leaves one door open. Not for a lost continent, for drowned coastlines, submerged landscapes, real catastrophes later magnified into legend. No vanished continent, but perhaps a seed of loss.
Now comes the uncomfortable part. The evidence does not behave like evidence. Supporters of Mu have pointed to ancient tablets, shared symbols, flood legends, megalithic sites, supposed linguistic parallels, and cultural similarities stretched across oceans. At first glance, it sounds persuasive. Enough mysteries piled together can feel like proof. But method matters. Similarity is not proof of contact. Contact is not proof of shared origin. And shared origin is not proof of a lost mother continent. A spiral in one culture and a spiral in another do not automatically point to Mu. Flood myths in distant societies do not automatically lead back to one drowned world. Humans build monuments. Humans fear water. Humans watch the stars. Humans repeat shapes. Humans tell the same kinds of stories because they live under the same sky and die by the same sea. This is one of the oldest traps in alternative history, taking broad patterns and forcing them into one dramatic answer. And when the specific claims are examined more closely, many grow weaker, not stronger. Some translations used to support Mu are disputed or rejected. Some comparisons are selective. Some timelines do not align. Some conclusions appear only after several layers of interpretation by people already committed to the legend. That is not strong evidence. Real evidence resists the storyteller. It does not arrange itself into a perfect myth. And then there's the silence. No accepted capital of Mu. No undisputed inscriptions from Mu. No confirmed artifacts from a Pacific mother civilization of tens of millions. No archaeological layer that clearly says this was the center. Could traces of ancient coastal cultures now lie underwater? Certainly. Could real disasters have seeded later stories? Absolutely. But that is a different claim from Churchward's giant empire. And giant claims do not survive on suggestion. They survive on proof. Mu has atmosphere. Mu has drama. Mu has narrative gravity. What it does not have is confirmed evidence. Patterns can seduce. Proof must endure.
This is where the story becomes more human and more believable. Because while a giant lost Pacific continent is not supported by geology or archaeology, the emotion beneath the legend may still point towards something real. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose by around 120 meters. That is not a poetic number. That is coastline after coastline disappearing, river mouths drowning, lowland plains vanishing, habitats collapsing, human communities being pushed inland generation after generation. Now imagine living through that, not as a graph, as a family, as a shoreline, as a burial ground that used to be on land and is now beneath the tide. Add earthquakes, add tsunamis, add volcanic eruptions, add island collapses, add storms that tear roofs away and leave salt in the soil. Then imagine how those events survive in memory. A grandmother says the sea once stood beyond the reef. A priest remembers a village sleeping under the waves. A navigator carries the name of a homeland no child has seen. A story begins. Then it grows. A drowned valley becomes a kingdom. A lost coastline becomes a continent. A regional trauma becomes sacred history. That transformation is not ignorance, it is myth-making. And myth-making is one of the oldest survival tools human beings possess. Mu, in that sense, may not be a place. It may be a compression of many losses into one unforgettable image. Not a literal map, an emotional fossil. A legend formed where memory, disaster, migration, and imagination meet. That version of Mu is less spectacular than the lost continent fantasy. But in another way, it is more haunting, because it feels true to how people actually remember catastrophe. Not as data, as story. Not fact, not fiction. A wound with a name.
There is also an ethical problem here, and it cannot be ignored. The myth of Mu was not always harmless wonder. In many retellings, it became part of a colonial habit of thought, the refusal to believe that indigenous peoples could have built, navigated, organized, and imagined greatness on their own. This matters especially in the Pacific, because Polynesian navigators achieved one of the greatest feats in human history. Using stars, ocean swells, cloud patterns, bird behavior, seasonal knowledge, and astonishing mental maps, they crossed enormous distances of open ocean and settled islands scattered across millions of square miles. That brilliance is real. It is documented. It does not require a vanished supercivilization to explain it. And yet myths like Mu were often used, directly or indirectly, to suggest that such achievements must have come from somewhere else, some lost teachers, some drowned mother race, some superior external source. That Mu is not innocent. It turns living cultures into echoes. It reduces achievement to inheritance. It strips real navigators, builders, and storytellers of authorship over their own past. In that sense, Mu did more than distort history. It sometimes helped colonial imagination devalue it. Because once you assume greatness must have come from elsewhere, you stop seeing the genius already in front of you. The double-hulled canoe, the star path, the oral map, the precision of wayfinding across a horizon that outsiders saw as empty. Mu can be fascinating as myth, but when myth is used to overshadow real human accomplishment, it stops being wonder and becomes erasure. That is the line we have to remember. A seductive legend can also be a theft.
And yet, Mu survives. Even after criticism, even after geology, even after archaeology, even after the evidence fails to appear. Why? Because stories do not survive on proof alone. They survive on emotional necessity. Mu gives the Pacific a secret. It gives history a missing chapter. It offers a golden age before the known world and a catastrophe large enough to explain silence itself. It tells us that modern civilization may not be the beginning of anything, only the broken remainder of something greater. That idea is intoxicating. It flatters us and terrifies us at the same time. We are not first, we are late. We inherited fragments and mistook them for origins. That feeling appears again and again in stories of Atlantis, Lemuria, antediluvian worlds, and hidden ancient wisdom. Mu belongs to that family, but it has a special power because of where it lives, the Pacific. A space so vast that absence feels believable there. A blue wilderness where horizon after horizon leaves room for imagination to keep building downward into the dark. And there is another reason Mu survives, because even if its map is false, its fear is real. Civilizations do vanish, coasts do drown, languages disappear, libraries burn, knowledge fragments. A people can lose not only land, but memory of how much land they once had. Mu gives that fear a face, a name, a shape beneath the waves. That may be why people keep returning to it, not because it is proven, because it resonates, because everyone, somewhere inside, knows what it means to lose a world. The myth survives because the fear does.
Now imagine it. one last time, not as science, as vision. A hot wind moving through limestone colonnades, torch smoke curling beneath painted ceilings, harbor ropes creaking, bronze bells ringing in the dusk, the smell of salt, cedar resin, wet flowers, fish oil, and cooking fires drifting through the city. Then something changes. The birds go silent first. Then the dogs begin to howl. The air turns sulfurous and heavy, thick in the throat, as if the whole island has started breathing from somewhere underground. A cup slips from a priest's hand and shatters on stone. Then comes the sound. Not thunder, not surf. A deep, cracking groan rising through the earth itself. The terrace jolts, columns tremble, dust falls from carved beams. Far beyond the city, a volcanic ridge splits open and spills a red seam of fire into the dark. People run, children scream, shell horns blast from the harbor. Then the sea withdraws. Too far, too fast. Fish writhe on black sand, boats lean into mud. For one impossible second, the whole coastline seems to inhale. And then the horizon rises. A wall of water carrying ash, uprooted trees, shattered hulls, and stone. The impact is deafening. Torches die in steam, temples burst apart. The smell of sulfur, salt, burning wood, and broken earth floods the air. Avenue after avenue disappears beneath black water. Voices vanish. Names vanish. Maps vanish. By dawn, the greatest civilization on Earth is no longer a civilization. It is a rumor. That is the emotional power of Mu. Even as fiction, it turns geological terror into human tragedy. It gives disaster architecture, breath, sound, and smell. And it leaves us with one unbearable question. If everything we build can vanish, what survives? Not empire, not certainty, only story. A world goes under. The echo remains.
So, was Mu the first civilization on Earth? No evidence from modern geology or archaeology supports the existence of a giant, lost Pacific continent in the way the legend describes. The classic version of Mu does not stand. But the story is still worth studying, because Mu reveals something real, even if it does not describe something real. It reveals how human beings respond to silence, how we fill gaps in the past with grandeur, how drowned coastlines, broken memories, colonial fantasy, scattered myths, and real fear can merge into one enormous lost world. It shows the power of storytelling, the danger of pseudo-history, the habit of denying indigenous genius, and the emotional truth that catastrophe can outlive fact in the form of legend.
Mu is wrong in ways that matter, but it is revealing in ways that matter too. It tells us that history is fragile. Memory is fragile. Civilization itself is fragile. And perhaps that is why the legend still breathes. Because deep down, every society suspects the same thing. One day, it too could become a fragment, a rumor, a symbol no one fully understands. Mu may never rise from the Pacific. But the question it leaves behind is real. How much of the human story is gone? And how much of what is gone survives only as myth? Maybe the lost continent was never beneath the ocean. Maybe it was always inside our forgetting. A legend sinks. A question remains.